small concession with these protests.
And Jack, there's a feeling as well, a huge dissatisfaction that the European Union has managed to find 50 billion euros in aid to send to Ukraine, and yet farmers in particular are on the receiving end of net zero targets, taxation on diesel and endless red tape. So many farmers, Jack, saying they're measuring ditches to see if they have to drain them or not. There are minimum requirements on the width of battery hen enclosures, endless red tape. As Jeremy Clarkson pointed out in Clarkson's farm in Britain, they've simply had enough and they're shouting, Ursula von der Leyen, we are here.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GBNews, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on Save the Nation. Tonight, Lee Anderson has been suspended from the Tory party after comments he made on GB News about Sadiq Khan and Islamism. The national debate about Islamophobia has been ignited, but tonight I will be defending Lee Anderson. While what he said was infelicitous, he should not have had the whip withdrawn. Meanwhile, the Lord Chancellor has announced foreign criminals will be deported as a means of freeing up prison spaces. And while this news is welcome, it does make you wonder why we weren't doing it before. And speaking of deportations, Shamima Beum has had her appeal against the revocation of her citizenship dismissed. And while I agree with the court's decision, the law is wrong on this. Shamima Beum should be allowed to return to be tried in British courts. Plus, today marks 40 years since the beginning of the popular British television programme Spitting Image. I'll be joined by the man who was the voice for one of the greatest prime ministers in British history, Margaret Thatcher. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my most Moggalicious panel this evening, the former Brexit Party MEP and current sister, Annunziata Rees-Mogg, and the author and broadcaster, Amy Nicole-Turner. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, it's what you've all been waiting for, the news of the day with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. The top story from the GB Newsroom tonight is that the London Mayor Sadiq Khan has now accused Lee Anderson of pouring petrol on the flames of Islamophobia. He was speaking after the Prime Minister described the former Tory Deputy Chairman's remarks as unacceptable, but refused to say that they were Islamophobic. Well, earlier, Lee Anderson admitted his words had been clumsy when he suggested Islamists had got control of the Mayor of London. He said he'd intended to highlight what he believes is Mr Khan's failure to tackle pro-Palestine protests. Sadiq Khan says Rishi Sunak needs to clearly condemn the remarks.
It's been more than 2 days now since this senior Conservative made comments that were clearly racist, anti-Muslim and Islamophobic, and still no firm condemnation from the leader of the Conservative Party, the Prime Minister. The problem is you have a senior Conservative saying things that are clearly racist, anti-Muslim and Islamophobic. That's leading to an environment where anti-Muslim crime is spiralling, and what they're doing is pouring petrol on the flames of Islamophobia.
Well, Rishi Sunak says he has taken the appropriate action.
The most important thing is that the words were wrong. They were ill-judged, they were unacceptable, and that's what I believe, and that's why the whip has been suspended. And I think everyone can see that tensions are already running high, and what I want to do, I think what the country wants to see, is the heat taken out of this debate, and I think that's the right thing to do.
In other news today, the leader of the Scottish National Party in Westminster, Stephen Flynn, says the Speaker of the House of Commons has broken his word after he refused an SNP application for an emergency debate on Gaza. That's after Westminster was thrown into turmoil last week when, in a significant departure from parliamentary procedure, Sir Lindsay Hoyle allowed a Labour amendment to the SNP's motion, which was also about Gaza. Mr Flynn described today's decision as outrageous, and the number of MPs demanding a no-confidence vote in the Speaker has now reached 81. Meanwhile, Sir Keir Starmer says his party will deliver what he's called a future in Britain built by Britain if Labour wins the next election. He's expected to unveil a plan to run a so-called patriotic economy, which he says would include boosting home ownership and establishing the next generation of new towns. Housing Minister Lee Rowley described the plan as empty, but the chair of the Labour Party, Annalise Dodds, told GB News it's a change that Britain's economy needs.
Kind of expectations that people in our country used to have, that their kids would be better off than they were, that they'd have at least a slightly better quality of life. All of those dreams are just completely out of reach for very many people in our country. And Keir Starmer is absolutely determined to change that for the future, getting Britain building, actually making sure we have those good jobs up and down the country, reforming the planning system. The many changes that he's setting out today would make that big difference to British people.
Annalise Dodds. Now, for the latest stories, do sign up for GB News Alerts. Scan the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now back to Jacob.
Lee Anderson has been suspended from the Conservative Party following his remarks about Sadiq Khan regarding Islamism. Lee's comments were infelicitous, but he should not have had the party whip withdrawn. When Lee made these remarks, these were the words of a man profoundly concerned about the state of extremism in Britain. His concerns about Islamism are entirely legitimate and reflect views held across the country. Since the 7th of October, we have seen demonstrations every weekend in the capital city, which have included calls for jihad, calls for curses upon the Jews, explicit support for Hamas, explicit support for the Houthis in Yemen. We've seen people being assaulted and vandalism on statues and monuments, the discarding of Armistice Day, and fundamentally we have seen the emboldenment of Islamists with a new space created for them to thrive. Lee is not a racist, and neither were his remarks. They may have been hyperbolic, but Lee does not deserve to be suspended. Amidst all of these incidents that we have seen, the pro-Palestine marches, there is a feeling that people have been allowed to get away with breaking the law, as well as creating an environment of intimidation. We have seen a number of MPs targeted. We've seen road and rail traffic brought to a standstill. We saw even one of our own colleagues, Martin Dornby, assaulted during one of these protests with the police watching and doing nothing about it. And the police have powers to crack down on these incidents on occasions, but they have not done so. It's worth remembering that Sadiq Khan has considerable powers with respect to the Metropolitan Police. But as Lee Anderson has said, we have barely heard a peep from the mayor. Now, this is an entirely legitimate frustration, and despite its poor articulation, it's a feeling shared by many across the country. Sadiq Khan is not an Islamist, nor is he under their control. But his leadership on this issue, as well as others, has been very poor. And suspending Lee Anderson has turned Lee into the story, rather than this problem that we have of Islamism and extremism. And that's the real story, bigger and more concerning. It's that British democracy last week prostrated itself to an Islamist mob. Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle broke with convention, owing to fears of MPs' safety. This is a critical moment in the history of Parliament, but now seems we've forgotten about that, and that the opportunists have jumped on Lee Anderson's remarks to score political points. This is a moment that defines our civilization. Uncontrolled mass migration with a lack of integration, coupled with extremism and anti-British, anti-Western, anti-Semitic ideology, has led to this point. And we must not only have the right to debate it, as Lee Anderson did, but to act against it before it is too late. As ever, let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. Well, I'm delighted now to be joined by the Imam and broadcaster, Ajmal Masroor. Ajmal, thank you so much for coming back on GB News. Shouldn't we be concerned about the extreme slogans that have been shouted in the street and the acts of violence that we have seen over the protests since the 7th of October?
We should be very concerned about any acts of violence in any part of the world, especially in our country, in the UK. And of course, we are all standing together against all forms of hatred, all forms of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, any bigotry that we see in our society. We should stand together to fight it. What we are seeing, unfortunately, is inconsistency in our narrative. So, for example, Jacob, you've just given a fantastic monologue, or is it called Rees-Mogg? I really like the way they have played with your surname, in which you have described how Britain and its value and anti-Semitism and all of those are under threat. But you actually fail to recognize that Muslims and Islam is also part and parcel of Britain and the European narrative as it's been developed over centuries. Now, we want to stand together against all forms of bigotry, whether it is anti-Muslim bigotry, whether it is anti-Semitism or racism. So my point here is very simple. What we have seen in our country and in the world is, unfortunately, rise of extremism from left, right, and center. And we need to stand together and fight it by creating a moderate narrative of inclusion. You don't other me, and I don't other you. You and I belong to the same country. We belong to the same history, and we would like to create a space for our children for a better future. And we can't do that when we fight each other.
Look, I agree with what you're saying, and I think it's very important to remember that the overwhelming majority of Muslims in this country are peaceful, law-abiding, good British citizens, and that they have the rights and ought to enjoy the rights that all other British citizens enjoy. That's fundamental, and I'll be talking later about Shamima Beum in relation to her rights as a citizen. But there is a problem with some extremists who do want to change the nature of the state. And we have to be willing to talk about that. And we have to be willing to talk about it regardless of which religion they come from. If they were Catholic extremists, we should talk about them as Catholic extremists. It so happens that the extremists who have been responsible for terrorist attacks in recent years are Islamist extremists.
Of course, statistically speaking, more attacks and threats of attack has come from the right-wing extremists in our country who are not Muslim. And these are proven by records, not just in the UK, but the United States of America and Europe. Yes, I agree that there are extremists from the Muslim community. I don't know whether you know, Jacob, but I live with 2 death threats at the moment. I have received death threats from the Al-Shabaab group in Somalia and the ISIS lot in the Middle East. And I had to go in hiding for 5 years. I could not give my home address to anybody. That's an awful way to live. In fact, 2 weeks ago, as an imam, when I came out of the mosque, I was actually pushed by somebody who had come to pray because he did not like my words of unity, harmony, and peace. He didn't like it. He wanted me to speak about disharmony and disunity. So we do have rotten apples in all camps, in all societies. How do we deal with it? We deal with it by looking at the root causes of this disharmony, troubles that we see amongst ourselves. The biggest cause is ignorance. Our history is the same. We share our Christian, Jewish, as well as Muslim history. We're supposed to be the family of Abraham. We're more similar than different. Even if we leave aside our Abrahamic relationship, on human level, we're very similar. What we also see in the world is proliferation of greed and hunger for power, dishonesty, and of course, inconsistencies within our world. And the third, we see a whole load of hypocrisies amongst all societies, not just one society. And unless we deal with them all, Jacob, my daughter said to me yesterday, Daddy, what kind of a human being would not call for a ceasefire? What kind of a human being? And she's only 16. And I'm telling her, she goes, Daddy, stop arguing with me. Everybody should call for a ceasefire in the Middle East and then talk about peace. When we have MPs in the parliament debating whether to call for a ceasefire or no ceasefire, we lose the moral high ground. We need to protect lives at all costs, and we're failing to do that as leaders of our society.
The ceasefire issue is a different question from the one today, But I think your influence as an imam in what you've been saying is so fundamentally important, and I find it very difficult to disagree with you that there is a commonality across the Abrahamic faiths, the belief in a single God, the monotheism, and some of the shared traditions, and that the influence of people like you is fundamentally important. But that doesn't deny that there are extremists, and to that extent, Lee Anderson was right to say that they seem to be making the and voices like yours seem not to be heard.
Well, Lee Anderson's problem is, he said London, particularly, is being taken over, or somehow the inference is that it's been taken over by extremists when it comes to the Muslim background. That's not true, actually. We have less than 10% of the population of London who are of minority ethnic, and a small number of that is Muslim. So it's impossible for Muslims to take over governance of London. Just because Sadiq Khan comes from a Muslim background, he doesn't rule by Islamic law, he rules by British law that you and I abide by, and you enact in the parliament. The problem with Lee Anderson is that he did not make that distinction. And secondly, it came at the back of this unfortunate development in the Middle East. Gaza has been bombed, more than 30,000 people have been killed. Lots and lots of people on both sides have lost huge amounts of life and property. And we could all stop that immediately if we stop blaming each other. We could stop that by calling for a ceasefire now. And people who are coming on the street and demanding a ceasefire, don't call them terrorists or extremists. They're also human beings. They're also non-Muslims. By the way, majority of them are from
hold on,
background.
Hold on. This is very important, because you've got people coming to the streets, which is, I think, what Lee was talking about, in the feeling that that was London being taken over every weekend and the police not doing anything about it. Now, I accept that many of them are peaceful, but some of them are not. And even one of my GB News fellow presenters was assaulted at the event last Wednesday, had eggs thrown at him and liquid thrown at him, with the police looking on and doing nothing. And that's when people feel that Islamist extremists can behave illegally and the police stand by and do nothing, and the police are at least partly the responsibility of Sadiq Khan. That, I think, was what Lee was getting at.
I understand. A few weeks before that, in London, when there was a counter-march organised by Tommy Robinson and his thugs, they threw more petrol bomb and rubbish at the police than anyone else has ever done in any of the last 10 or 12 weeks of marches. They, maybe 200 of them attended that march. More than 100 were arrested. In other words, more than 50% of the right-wing thugs were arrested for their racist bigotry, for their violence against the police and disorder. And when it comes to the Palestinian march, we have had, 500,000, 1 million people on the street, 20, 30 people get arrested. Whoever is arrested, Jacob, if they have broken the law, I will be on the side of the police to say, arrest them, try them, put them behind bars. But our fundamental right to protest against our government's foreign policy, Israeli government's insistent on occupying Palestine and not even talking about ending occupation, all of these things are all about us saying enough is enough. We want peace in the Middle East, and we're not hearing that from yourself.
And you're absolutely right to defend the right to peaceful protest. It's just when it's not peaceful. And I'm certainly no advocate for Tommy Robinson, who, if he breaks the law, deserves to be arrested and has been arrested many times. Thank you very much for coming back on Ajmal. We hope to speak again in the not-too-distant future. Joining me now is my panel of former Brexit Party MEP Annunziata Rees-Mogg and the author and broadcaster Amy Nicole Turner. Amy, do you think Lee should have lost the whip?
I do. I definitely do. I can't believe that you can't see that he profoundly spoke about a minority in the way that he did, and it's not seen for what it is, which was outright bigotry. I think it came from a place of ignorance. So I almost want to, I feel sorry for Lee, really. I want to be able to forgive him. But can you imagine if he said the same sort of sentiment about Jewish people? If he said, "Oh, the Jews are running London," can you imagine that? That would be deemed outright anti-Semitism instantly, and he would have gone.
We'll come back to that, but we've got a clip from Sadiq Khan, so let's just have a look at what he had to say.
It's been more than 2 days now since this senior Conservative made comments that were clearly racist, anti-Muslim and Islamophobic, and still no firm condemnation from the leader of the Conservative Party, the Prime Minister. The problem is you have a senior Conservative saying things that are clearly racist, anti-Muslim and Islamophobic. That's leading to an environment where anti-Muslim crime is spiralling, and what they're doing is pouring petrol on the flames of Islamophobia.
So, Nunziata, is that a fair point for the mayor to make?
I think Lee Anderson says it how he sees it, and he doesn't always think that thoroughly about being diplomatic or particularly professional in his tone or language before he says things. And actually, do you know what? I think we need a lot more of that in this country.
Characterising a minority.
Not less. But what we really, really need is for Sadiq Khan to stand up and be a leader, like Ajmal just was, condemning the Islamist minority that is giving a lot of Muslims a bad time because people do confuse the two. And if there was really strong leadership from the Mayor of London in the policing, then I think people would have a clearer way.
I can say it as I see it. Islamophobia, as hate crimes, have gone up by 300% since October the 7th.
But so have Islamist attacks
it's just
and
simply not
violent
true.
demonstrations.
So let's take the marches as an example. Who was arrested more on the marches? Was it the far-right thugs that turned up, or was it the peaceful protesters? It was the far-right thugs that caused the most of the arrests that happened on that day.
But an awful lot of the illegal activity that was being undertaken by the Islamists was not stopped by the police. It was not even investigated, as far as we know, by the police. That there have been a huge number of crimes we know have taken place and have not been tackled.
And one of the cases that went to court was then judged by somebody who'd liked an anti-Semitic tweet.
However,
which is quite important.
You were talking about the paragliders incident, right? Yeah, OK, putting that to one side for a minute, 80% of the public actually are calling for a ceasefire. This is hardly a radical view. Now, 80% of the British public are not Muslim, let alone Islamist.
This isn't about the ceasefire issue.
No, but it is, isn't it?
Islamist. This is about a terrorist issue. It's not a Muslim issue, but we do need Muslim leaders to condemn it in the way that we're absolutely right to condemn Tommy Robinson and the whole of the far right for their violent actions.
I think when I have this panel on, I need 2 hours rather than 1 because they are so feisty. But coming up next, foreign criminals are set to be deported to ease up space in prison. But surely we should be doing this anyway. Plus, Shamima Beum has had her appeal dismissed, but I will be making the case for her to be tried by a jury or in front of a jury.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Chris, what is the preferred way in which the police go about their business at the moment? There's these two strands of thinking: evidence-based policing versus bobbies on the beat.
It's very, very difficult. The problem that police have got, basically, is that they're too thinly spread, and it's too much is expected of them. There's a long list, isn't it? Every month we hear police need to do more about this, police need to do more about that, and police do their best. They're overwhelmed with bureaucracy. I mean, when I was a young PC, if I took a shoplifter in, then I'd be in and out within an hour. You take a shoplifter in now, and you're doomed for the rest of your shift for 6 or 7 hours dealing with the bureaucracy. Police want to get back in those communities because community policing is really the core of policing. But such are the demands on their time at the moment, and the bureaucracy, and the fact that they are struggling now to retain experienced officers. People are hemorrhaging out of the police, and new recruits coming in haven't got that experience, and there's a good chance they may not stay anyway. So there's all sorts of problems. And for the Home Secretary to glibly say he wants more done, frankly, clearly shows he's got no understanding of the pressure police are under, and of course the constant criticism that they face across the board. Very rarely do you actually hear of police officers getting praised for acts of bravery or acts of compassion. So there's a problem with morale in the police force, and it's clearly a problem with the Home Secretary, who needs to get out there and talk to officers on the front line who frankly are struggling. And last night, of course, was a graphic example.
every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Right, welcome back. We've been discussing the topic of the day, which is Lee Anderson and Islamophobia, and you've been sending in your mail mogs. Graham says Lee Anderson has brought out the discussion on Islamic extremism. He has highlighted it. He hasn't distracted from it. And Barry says, thank you for clearly defining the state and relationship of the majority of the British public's understanding of extreme Islamism. Our freedom to express our honest beliefs has been hard-earned over the centuries and should not be undermined by Middle Eastern concepts and practices. The Lord Chancellor, the Lord High Chancellor indeed, Alex Chalk, has announced today that foreign criminals, including thieves and drug dealers, will be deported as a means of freeing up space in prison. And it has been known for some time that our prisons are full to the brim, which has prompted serious questions about why England and Wales have more than 10,000 foreign criminals in prison, making up about 10% of the total prison population. In other words, while this development is welcome, isn't it surprising that we weren't doing it before? Well, my panel is still with me. You remember them all: Annunziata, current sister, and Amy Nicole Turner, author and broadcaster. Amy, surely it's a really sensible thing to do, chuck them out.
Yeah, you'd think it'd be really sensible. I mean, but however, since 2010, I think there's been 30% less deportations. So the Conservatives are good at talking about it, but they're not good about putting it into practice. But I think sometimes if things seem really simple, they're sometimes not, are they? So if we take the example of, do you remember the infamous Jamaica 50 flight? People say, of course, these people should be deported. They're foreign nationals. When in reality, a lot of them, they were brought up here, they came here as children, they were put into prison for very petty crimes, but they had children here, families here, and it didn't make sense to deport them.
But I think the majority here are Romanian and Polish, aren't they? The biggest number.
But why are they serving sentences? Because anyone who's serving over 12 months is deported.
Is meant to be deported.
So these are
why don't we
normally
just deport
petty
them?
crimes, aren't they?
There are about 10,000 of them. But as I understood it, what Alex Chalk wants to do is deport those who are on remand. And I actually disagree with that. That if you haven't had a fair trial...
Well, you're not guilty whilst you're on remand.
Exactly. You are innocent until you're proven guilty. And to deport, not only deport people, but ban them from re-entry to this country seems just a little bit extreme for people who have not faced trial.
OK, I thought it was deporting them at the end of the trial.
It's the 3,000 who are on remand he seemed to want to deport. The 10,000 who are already in prison, personally, I would deport tomorrow.
But you can tell why he wants to deport them, because it's got this absolutely ridiculous backlog, and it would take a problem off his shoulders, wouldn't it? I think 28% of the prison population are on remand.
I can't believe Alex Chalk would do that, because he has a proper feeling for British justice. I'd be astonished if he thought that people should be deemed guilty.
That was what the article appeared to say. It could have been misunderstanding him. But I think once you have stood trial, if you have been a guest in this country, you lose your right to be a guest or to return.
So, you are a murderer, not you personally, but there is a murderer who is tried and is sent abroad at the end of his trial because he's found guilty, and his home country lets him out after 6 weeks. Do you mind?
He's not allowed back in this country.
But we always talk about the extremes. We always go to the murderers, the rapists. We're not talking about those really.
Hard cases make bad law.
We're talking about the shoplifters. We're talking about the drugs offences.
Well, they should definitely be removed, all the shoplifters.
I think all the drug use definitely should be out.
On the theme of immigration, former Prime Minister Liz Truss's Growth Commission has revealed new analysis which has shown slashing net migration would leave the average person better off by £1,100 per year. And so, contrary to orthodoxy, which suggests immigration is good for the economy, this new research reinforces the idea that having mass migration has decreased GDP per capita in Britain. So while GDP, that's the total annual income of the country, may have gone up, per individual, actually immigration has made us poorer. Well, back to my panel. Nunziata, we've been arguing this for some time, haven't we? It's good to have the figures.
It's great that someone else is pointing this out, that immigration boosts one level of financial reporting and really damages the individuals in this country. And it seems so obvious that each household in the United Kingdom, according to the OBR, who do get things wrong, so please don't blame me if they're not accurate, each household costs government spending of £42,000 in this country. It is £18,000 per person. And we are surprised that when we increase the population, the overall income goes down.
And they've also found that people who come from poorer countries who are doing the less well-paid jobs are the ones who have the biggest drag on GDP per capita. And therefore, surely we need to be employing people domestically, but also automating and investing in innovation that reduces the need for cheap labour.
I'm sure that would be ideal, but unfortunately we've got massive vacancies at the moment, and I think because of all this free market that you're such a huge fan of, maybe the wages are kept very, very low, and what we need is strong unions. But just to rewind, can we be very cautious of this growth commission? Because I think if we look at the funding and the sources that are contributing to this study, I'm not convinced this is a trustworthy source. It's also supported by Liz Truss, and really, she's not the architect of growth. She's the architect of shrink.
No, but this is
tried and tested.
This has been done by serious academics.
But who are the serious academics
people like Shanker
funded
Singham are
by?
involved with
This is not really an organisation that I would give much
credit
or kudos to.
Most big business makes the case for cheap labour because it lowers their costs. So it's very rare to get big business funding reports that say that cheap labour isn't actually the ever-sucking lollipop that they think it is.
With all these arguments, I never actually see any push towards rising wages for the indigenous population or the migrant population.
But that's the whole point.
It's very basic logic. That if you have people who will come in and do things very cheaply because they are used to a lower standard of living than we are in the United Kingdom, then wages will be depressed because employers will want to pay the least they possibly can for the same work. Now, if you stop that tide of cheap labour, the indigenous population's wages will have to increase so that employers can actually have staff on their shop floors or wherever it is they require them. This is good for anyone who is here because their wages will go up.
But historically that doesn't happen, does it? And what we
when there are
probably
labour
need is more
shortages,
government
wages go up.
regulation
It works
to
like
set,
any other supply.
More government regulation. Government regulates all of our life
already.
already.
For example, last week we were talking a lot about the care sector. There is very little regulation of that. There is no
but
strong
wages
unions.
need to rise.
So you place the blame on migrant labour plugging the shortages, whereas I'm saying there needs more regulation to make the wages higher for anyone doing the job.
I think there's no problem.
Regulation puts up the costs, but it doesn't increase the wages
There we go.
of people who need them.
Fantastic. Thank you to my distinguished Moggalicious panel. Coming up, and do listen to the next segment, because I think it's really interesting, and you may be surprised by my view, but the jihadi bride Shamima Beum should be tried for her alleged crimes in front of a jury in this country. It defends all of our rights. Plus, on a slightly lighter note, today marks the 40th anniversary of Spitting Image, and we'll be hearing from the man who was the voice for Margaret Thatcher's puppet.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
Mike Freer joins me now. Mike, thank you very much for coming into the studio.
Thank you for inviting me.
Firstly, how are you?
It's been a busy day, and it's been quite a traumatic experience. It's a real wrench to walk away from a job that you love, but also a constituency that you've become. You know, I live there; it's my home, and I regard many of my constituents as friends, and it is an amazing place. And to walk away from that is really it's quite an emotional wrench to think this was a job I loved, but unfortunately I can't do it anymore.
Can you talk me through the process? Because you mentioned about the alleged arson attack, etc., being the final straw, but this has been a really quite vile journey to get to this point. So what kind of threats have you had? What's that look like?
Well, like every MP, I mean, you day in, day out, you get abusive emails, you get low-level stuff that, whether we should accept it, but we do, it's graffiti, it's things like, in the past I've had a mock Molotov cocktail left on the office door, meaning we had to evacuate the whole building. I've come out of my house and found a note on my car. Where I live is common knowledge, but what I drive is less so. And it's a few weeks after John Mann had the wheel nuts on his car tampered with. So that all kind of makes you get a bit, what on earth's going on. But I've had 2 run-ins with the organisation that was Muslims Against Crusades, and people like Anjem Chowdhury, who was behind that organisation, been to prison. But online it said, I used to do surgery in mosques, so I wanted to go out and see people. And online there's a picture of me saying, you're not welcome in our mosque, let Stephen Timms be a pointed reminder. So it's not very subtle.
Well, just for our viewers and listeners who might not remember that,
Stephen Timms, of course, was stabbed by a woman who'd been radicalised. Thank heavens he survived. So it was a very unsubtle.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, thank you for coming back, as I asked you to. We've been discussing foreign criminals and mass migration's effect on GDP, and Helen has mailed Mogg to say too little too late on deporting foreign criminals. Our prisons have been in disarray for too long already. And Graham says, hi, Jacob, what about Commonwealth Service personnel that are serving a custodial sentence? Should they be deported, having served on operational duty for the UK? That's a very good question. Last week, the infamous jihadi bride, Shamima Beum, had her appeal against the decision to revoke her British citizenship dismissed by the Court of Appeal, leaving unanswered questions over whether her legal team will take the case to the Supreme Court. I agree with this judgment. The court has interpreted the law as it is set out and maintained the supremacy of Parliament. However, the law undermines 2 ancient rights, one of equality before the law of every citizen equally, and second, trial by jury. For Magna Carta, you should not be penalised without the judgment of your peers. This is unfortunately a consequence of mass migration, allowing too many people to come into this country who do not necessarily share our values. But its arbitrary nature is un-British and risky. As William Shawcross has pointed out, the PREVENT programme is not at all satisfactory. Even I was thought worth considering as part of the PREVENT programme. This means that people who have a right to any other citizenship could potentially be at risk from arbitrary action. So the failure of mass migration and of the state to deal with the threat that has been created will not be solved by arbitrary administrative action, but by the proper use of the law of the land. With me now is Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, as well as my brilliant panel that you know already. Alan, thank you very much for coming in. It seems to me that Shamima Beum is the hardest case to make, that she went out and she joined ISIS and may be considered a risk to security, but that if British citizens have committed crimes, they should be prosecuted and a jury should decide. That is the British way and has been for 809 years.
And yet the Court of Appeals and every previous court has disagreed and said that it's perfectly lawful.
That's not the point I was making. The point I was making, that Parliament can pass any law it likes, and the courts are quite right to interpret that in accordance with the will of Parliament. I'm not in favour of the law making things up, the judges making things up, but the law shouldn't be passed that deprives people of the right to trial by jury.
Well, I would say that in this instance, the Home Secretary at the time, Sajid Javid, was correct. I think the reason why, let's just look at why he did this. It was an extreme move, there's no doubt about it. Even in the judgment last week, the judge said this was, a harsh punishment. But as he pointed out, she was the author of her own misfortune. The reason that it was done was because this is somebody who left this country, joined a terrorist movement that wanted to overthrow this country.
Age 15, forcibly married, raped.
Well, you say that,
I do say that because it's true.
Well, you say that, but this is someone who showed no remorse, no change of mind. When the caliphate was going down, she was still there, not trying to flee, not saying, I was force-raped, I came to this.
But she was groomed at a 15-year-old and then
I don't think she was groomed. I think that's correct
we
to
know
say.
she was.
No,
she was online grooming.
I'm sorry, we don't know that at all.
We do.
We don't, Jacob.
That's not the point. It's the point that we have never allowed in this country that well, it's not quite true. There was torture in the early 17th century, late 16th century. But we have never, other than that, allowed secretaries of state, privy councillors, to punish people. Punishment is a job for the courts after a trial.
Well, this is not punishment. Why is it punishment?
Of course it's a punishment. You just said it was a punishment
No.
2 sentences ago.
I have said that it basically, the judge said that. What I'm saying here is that what's happened here is that you've had someone who has basically forfeited their right to citizenship. That's what they've done by joining.
That's decided by court, surely.
No, it's obvious, Jacob. It's as obvious as you claim the grooming was. OK, so it's obvious that she has done
the grooming,
so.
there is an electronic record of the grooming.
And there is physical and practical evidence that she left this country to join the terrorist movement.
Evidence of that kind is always tried by a court.
I'm not sure that's correct. And actually, what the Home Secretary at the time had stated was that because her crime was particularly bad, because there was a genuine fear of national security being compromised by her return...
he decided with no judge and no jury.
Well, he took legal advice and he's been vindicated.
He's not a judge.
He's been vindicated by the judge.
No, the law gave him the power to do it. That's not the point.
But he's been vindicated by...
That's not the point. The argument is whether the law is right. It's completely separate.
Well, the law, I would say the law is right. You would say it's wrong, but both of us would say that it's lawful.
I'd also say it could then happen to anybody who has any alternative right to citizenship. Because you've never been to Bangladesh, you've never claimed Bangladesh. So any Jewish person in this country has a right to citizenship of Israel. Can they have their citizenship taken away by arbitrary act?
If they join a foreign terrorist movement that seeks to overthrow the state, I would expect it to happen. No, I'm sorry, I would. I would expect that to happen.
And you assume with the government that we've got, with the Home Office that we've got, that it is competent to do that? The Home Office that fails again and again?
It's been proven competent in this case, time and time again.
All that has been shown is that the law gives the discretion to the Home Secretary. That's quite proper.
Well, hang on. Nobody is seriously suggesting that the Home Secretary... You were saying that your colleague, Sajid Javid, was not competent. Is that what you're saying?
The Home Office is routinely incompetent. Nunziata.
The Home Office is, yes, incapable of competence, as far as one can tell, most of the time. I do wonder about the inconsistency of this. What happens if any of us commits a crime and we join a foreign terrorism organisation? Where do we go?
We're fine. We can't have our citizenship taken away.
Because we don't happen to have a foreign parent.
So we've created two classes of citizenship.
Two completely separate classes of people. I personally would not be against people who had come here, who had applied for citizenship, who had been granted it, having it then taken away should they go against our country, our nation and our people. But I think people who are born as British citizens, that is an irrevocable right.
Yeah, exactly. It sets an incredibly dangerous precedent for anyone with dual nationality, this case. And I think people can see what I've always said about this case is if Shamima Beum, who was a child, she was 15 years old, if she looked like me and went to Syria to join ISIS, it would be... Everyone would say she was groomed. Oh, my goodness, this organisation has taken this innocent child. But because Shamima Beum happens to be half Bangladeshi, full Bangladeshi parents, but, as you said, never even been to Bangladesh, never visited, nothing, suddenly she's not our problem. I can't...
I think there's a bizarre theoretical bubble we're living in here. It's not the real world, OK, out there. The real world out there knows what someone does who joins terrorist organisations. They know it.
But
people on the streets understand it and know it. They know it.
This is the Guantanamo Bay approach. You don't like people, so you lock them up with what trial. This country has a proud record of trial in front of a jury going back to 1215. You do not protect your values by throwing in the bin when it's inconvenient.
We haven't locked her up. What we have said is that she cannot return. She cannot return because national security threat.
Dispossessed.
She's a national security threat. You would like more. You've just been having a whole segment on national security threats, and you would want more national security threats.
I think mass migration has been a problem and a great mistake of policy, and we should tighten up our borders, and that's fundamentally important. But people who are British citizens have the rights of British citizens.
And a fair trial, surely.
And a fair trial.
Yeah.
I have no problem with what Sajid Javid did in this case. None whatsoever.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to my panel as well. Coming up, today marks the 40th anniversary of Spitting Image. Though almost everyone called it Spitting Images, which was slightly wrong. And I'll be reminiscing with the man who was the voice for Margaret Thatcher. So Margaret Thatcher live on GB News, thanks to Steve Nolan.
On Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, it's the row threatening to tear the Tories apart following these comments by Lee Anderson.
These Islamists have got control of our country, but what I do believe is they've got control of Khan.
Sacked by his party, criticised by many.
What Lee said was wrong, it was unacceptable.
These comments from a senior Conservative are Islamophobic, are anti-Muslim and are racist.
Now, Lee Anderson speaks out.
I think the party could have given me a little bit more backing. Who has got control of Parliament Square? Is it the extremists or is it Mayor Khan? I admit some of my speech was a little bit clumsy at times.
Tonight, Lee Anderson speaks exclusively to GB News on Patrick Christie's Tonight from 9 p.m. Be there.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Marnie says being sexy in business is entirely possible and maybe even better.
Well, Marnie, this is something I say is true. I've had to live with this for quite a long time, and I think you can do both. Now, tell me, it's lovely to see you first of all.
Thank you for having me.
In all your gorgeousness. And you're telling me that that often is regarded as something derogatory or something to hold you back. Is that right?
It's just this really unfair thing, this really unfair narrative that women can't do both. Even men can do it, as you know, Eamon. You can do it. You can do it all. And I just think, you know, women are so multifaceted. They can be mothers, they can be sexy, they can be businesswomen, they can be silly, they can be all these different dimensions. And this press push that we have to limit ourselves to one category is just unfair.
But do you think that is where some people may be wrong-footed or go wrong to underestimate you?
Exactly. There is that saying, disarm with charm. So, you know, that there is that idea that people do look at someone who cares about how they look, who's perhaps a bit feminine, and underestimate them. But hopefully I've proved that wasn't the case in the boardroom.
And thank goodness for Karen Brady. She's definitely upped the glam stakes on the show. And if anybody can prove that you can be sexy and successful in business, I suppose it's her, really. But where do you think most of the criticism comes from? Because I have to say, hard to believe, but when I was younger, I certainly got a bit of this at my old employer, being told that I had to dress a certain way, not to be too sexy, which I found hugely offensive.
You were told this by women.
I was told this by a female boss who didn't like me wearing zips on the back of my dress. Not just me, but some of the other presenters there. And I took such offence. I felt like she thought that I was some sort of, I don't know what. Do you take offence when people are criticising you that, you know, in some way they think you're, I don't know?
There's just no right answer. And as we said, I think Karen Brady is doing an excellent job at leading the charge that you can be glamorous and get the job done.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm sure many of us enjoyed Spitting Image. Who can forget the way the show ruthlessly lampooned some of the biggest political figures of the time? John Major being greyed out, Norman Tebbit as a skinhead, and, of course, Margaret Thatcher chomping her cigar. Today, the satirical puppet show celebrates its 40th anniversary. Where has the time gone? Well, with me now is the man who himself provided the voice of Mrs. Thatcher's puppet, Steve Nallen. Steve, we can have a look at some of your greatest hits.
Let's remember, eh?
Yes.
Is anyone not unanimous?
We're slightly, what's the opposite of unanimous?
Tell him, Leon. Unanimous? Wrong! The opposite of unanimous is fired!
Please, sir.
Thank you. Geoffrey, this is a French one. As a wife and mother, I still like to get the best meat bargains for my money. New Zealand lamb, 89 pence a pound. English lamb, 90 pence a pound. But for my money, the best value has got to be Falklands lamb. Only £1,435,000 a pound. Delicious.
I'd forgotten about that one. I'd forgotten about that sketch.
And you did that voice?
Oh, goodness me. Yes, I was there from the very, very first programme. Goodness me. 40 years ago tonight. Isn't it frightening?
And it was an amazing programme and did all sorts of things that people hadn't expected. You were much ruder about politicians than people had been before.
Well, people talk about the Punch and Judy nature of politics, and in a way, because the Spitting Image had puppets in it, we were literally the Punch and Judy of politics. And you saw from that clip that there was far more violence in that programme than there'd ever been on television. But you could argue that, that came from the parliamentarians themselves, who could be verbally violent.
And you had a political impact, that the relationship between David Steele and David Owen with Little David and Big David had a real effect on the Liberals and the SDP and how they were seen by the public.
The irony there was it was pure chance, because David Owen was made to be a big puppet and David Steele just happened to be a little puppet. But sometimes it seemed to reflect the political reality of the day, and that was what we tried to do in general was, our producer went down to the House of Commons and spoke to MPs and said who's up, who's down, what are people like behind the scenes, and got an insight into what people were like, and that then fed onto the show.
You were doing a lot of homework in building the show, and some politicians you really helped. I mean, you helped Norman Tebbit's image and made him an even more popular figure as this great tough thug.
Roy Hattersley, I did him. He was the eponymous hero of Spitting Image, because he was the only character who did the spitting. And he quite liked it, because he said to me, he said, I went to speak at the police convention last week, and I went onto the podium, and as I began to speak, the entire first 4 rows put up umbrellas. And he saw himself as a sort of an avuncular figure, whereas other characters, Kenneth Baker, for example, we portrayed him, and a great political tradition in caricature, as an animal, as a slug. And in fact, Roy Hattersley said to me, he said, facing him across the dispatch box, I think you've got the slug perfectly correct. So I don't think, probably Kenneth Baker wasn't terribly happy about that. So I think some people we were kinder to some than others, I think.
And your ability to the accents is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, your Roy Hattersley is exactly how he sounds.
Well, you don't need to caricature Roy Hattersley, because that's the way he speaks. With Mrs. Thatcher, it was more complicated, because she had a much higher voice when we began, and she had that traditional way of speaking. Please let me finish, it's an important point.
But what's so funny is you move like Margaret, little head movements.
Well, it's part of it. To get the voice, you've got to move like. But they said to me, look, this is what the puppet looks like. It's a rather cruel, picture, and that was the intention. So as you remember, there was no televising of the House of Commons in those days. It was purely on radio. So I listened to the radio version of Mrs Thatcher, and in the House of Commons she was very different. The right honourable gentleman does not understand the nature of fiscal policy. He doesn't... And so I took that very harsh voice, which was crueler and much stronger, and it matched the puppet.
And you've got a book out, Destination Time Travel.
A very, very different sort of
subject. No, you're not the time travel of puppets.
No, we're not going back in time. It's a history of time travel in film and television, which I've written with Dick Fiddy of the British Film Institute. And, yeah, it's doing very well because everybody loves time travel. And in a way, we all have our memories, which is the great human gift of time travel, and it's great to remember Spitting Image tonight.
Well, we've travelled back 40 years in a few sentences, and it's been great fun. Just a brief word on the Queen Mother.
Oh, I decided to do her as Beryl Reid because we didn't know what she talked like, so I borrowed Marlene that she did, because the Queen Mum and Beryl Reid spent all day being a credit to the nation.
It's absolutely brilliant. For those of you who are too young to have seen it, it was a most entertaining and funny programme, and the politicians who were lampooned, by and large, loved it. Anyway, thank you very much, Steve. That's all from me. Up next, it's Patrick Christie's. Patrick, what is on your bill of fare this evening?
Well, we've got a lot on, Jacob, but the big one, of course, is the interview, and it's only on GB News, and it's the interview with Lee Anderson. Now, Lee has spoken incredibly firmly and frankly about a series of issues. He's pushed back massively on allegations of Islamophobia. He's doubled down on Sadiq Khan. He's spoken about questions as to whether or not your party and Rishi Sunak have thrown him under the bus. He's spoken a bit about what he's going to do at the next general election and much, much more. So it really is the place to be, and the only place to watch it, of course, is on my show this evening.
Well, absolutely. Lee has said he spoke clumsily, hasn't he? Do you think that counts as an apology from the point of view of Central Office, and they might be thinking of giving him the whip back?
Well, I asked him directly about whether or not he feels as though he's got anything to directly apologise for, and he is, as you would imagine, quite firm on that. I think he's had a lot of time to think about the situation over the weekend, and without giving too much away, I think he feels incredibly buoyed by a lot of public support. That is not, of course, to dismiss the fact that he is accused of some very serious things, and a lot of people think that he was wrong.
But there is, to some extent, to which it represents the mood of people up and down the country.
I think the concern, maybe for the Conservative Party, if I was Rishi Sunak, I would watch this show, because big concerns about what it might mean for the weather.
You should always watch your programme. Thank you, Patrick. That's all. We're going to the weather. It'll be glorious in Somerset. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. About 8 o'clock tomorrow.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening, welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. It could be quite a cold and foggy start for some areas tomorrow morning. We'll also see some rain pushing in to the north and west. We have got high pressure dominating for the rest of the day and through the night, but we do also have this northeasterly breeze and cold air. So it will be a cold evening and a cold night, in fact, particularly where we're exposed to stronger winds across the far southeast. But many areas will see a frost developing in inland rural areas. Also, there's a risk of some mist and fog, particularly across central and southeastern areas where we have had quite a lot of rain recently. There'll be a very cold start tomorrow, where really could be down to -3 or 4, but the far northwest frost will be more limited as some wet weather is arriving through the course of the night. That will bring a damp start to the day, particularly for northern Scotland, but that wet weather will push into parts of southern Scotland as well as North Wales, northern England too. We'll see some of that rain through Tuesday afternoon. Further south and east, though, it should stay largely dry, but it will be a bit of a cloudier day compared to today. The rain will sink into the southeast over the course of Tuesday night. Once it clears, though, we'll see another clear night and clear start to Wednesday, potentially some further mist and fog, but then the next batch of rain arrives from the west this time, so pushing into many western areas of the UK through the morning and then further east later on in the day. But that will pick the temperatures up a little bit, so temperatures will rise through Wednesday and Thursday before they fall again to end the week.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
to find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
You have a president in President Biden who's not enforcing the law that was passed by Congress. President Obama, criticize him or not, actually enforced the law and was deporting people that had crossed illegally. Of course, President Trump enforced the law and improved the law to make sure that and worked with Mexico to have the Remain in Mexico policy. Biden has abandoned federal policy. In fact, he's deliberately trying to let in as many immigrants as possible. More for the Democrats, more is better and less is racist.
Just astonishing. And the statement that Greg Abbott put out is really feisty stuff. He said the federal government has